Have you ever wondered what the real differences are between Sunni and Shia Islam? We're talking about a divide that involves nearly 2 billion people. But beyond the headlines and politics, what are the actual foundational disagreements that have shaped history for centuries? Okay, let's really get into it.
So, in this explainer, we're going to break down these core disagreements. We'll look at where it all started and how it affects everything from big theological ideas down to daily rituals. And just to be clear, our goal here is simply to lay out the different perspectives based on the source material. We're not here to pick a side.
All right, so where did this all kick off? You might be surprised to learn that the very first split wasn't about prayer or theology, it was about politics. Specifically, who should be in charge.
Okay, so picture this. It's the year 632. The Prophet Muhammad, the leader who united the entire community, has just passed away. And suddenly, there's this massive leadership vacuum. The single most important question is, who takes over now? The answer to that question would create a fracture that has lasted over 1,400 years.
This dispute immediately led to two totally different models for leadership. On one side, you have what would become the Sunni view. The leader, called the caliph, should be chosen by the community, through consultation and consensus. Their job is to protect the faith and manage the community's affairs. But the Shia perspective is completely different. For them, leadership isn't up for a vote. They believe the Prophet himself had already divinely appointed his successor, his cousin Ali, and that this special authority had to continue down a line of infallible imams from his family.
And you have to realize, this is a huge deal. For Shia Islam, this idea of the imamate is not just a political preference, it's a core pillar of the religion itself. I mean, this quote from their sources says it all. Faith isn't even complete without believing in it. So what might look like a simple political disagreement is instantly elevated into the realm of core fundamental theology.
So, as you can imagine, this initial political split started to have ripple effects, leading the two communities down different theological roads. And this brings us to one of the most complex areas of disagreement: how to understand the very nature of God. You see, in the Quran, God is described with certain attributes, like being all-seeing and all-hearing. The text also mentions things like God's hand or face. And this created a massive theological question. How are you supposed to understand these descriptions? Are they literal or are they metaphors? Well, this led to two very distinct approaches. The Sunni position is to affirm these attributes literally, just as they appear in the text. But, and this is the crucial part, they do so without asking how, and without ever comparing God to his creation. The Shia approach, on the other hand, argues that taking these words literally risks making God seem human-like. So, to preserve God's absolute uniqueness, they interpret these attributes metaphorically. God's hand, for example, becomes his power or his grace.
So these different theological paths also led to big disagreements about the very sources of the faith. Specifically, who could you trust to accurately pass down the Prophet's teachings?
The Sunni view holds that all of the Prophet's companions were righteous and are reliable sources for his traditions. But from the Shia perspective, it's more complicated. They're critical of the majority of those same companions because they believe they didn't support Ali's right to lead. So Shias generally only accept traditions passed down from the Prophet's family and the small group of companions loyal to them. And think about the implications of that. It basically creates two separate collections of prophetic traditions, or hadith, which are the very foundation of Islamic law and practice.
And this fundamental difference in who to trust leads us to what is probably the most sensitive and contentious issue of all: the integrity of the Quran itself.
Okay, let's break this down very carefully. The Sunni position is unequivocal. The Quran we have today is the exact, unaltered word of God, divinely protected from any change, period. Now, the official position of mainstream Shia scholars today is actually the same, that the text is complete and perfect. They say that when they talk about tahrif, or distortion, they're talking about a distortion of the meaning and interpretation, not the words themselves. The controversy comes from opponents who point to certain narrations in some older classical Shia books that seem to suggest that parts of the Quran, specifically verses that might have supported Ali's succession, were omitted.
All right, we've talked about some pretty heavy topics: leadership, theology, sources. But how does all this actually show up in the daily life of a regular person? Well, let's look at a perfect example: the simple act of washing before prayer.
This ritual purification is called wudu, and most of the steps are agreed upon by everyone. You wash the face, you wash the arms, you wipe the head. But when you get to that very last step, the feet, that's where you see a clear difference in practice.
It's actually pretty simple. Sunnis wash their feet. They do this based on their interpretation of the relevant verse in the Quran and the prophetic traditions they follow. Shias, however, wipe their feet. And they base this on an alternative and linguistically possible reading of that exact same Quranic verse, backed up by traditions passed down through their imams. It's a small physical difference, but it's a perfect example of how those foundational disagreements over sources and interpretation play out in real life.
So, as we've seen, what started out as a political disagreement over who should lead has cascaded down, creating fundamental differences in almost every aspect of the faith.
So let's recap real quick. We have the caliphate versus the imamate, a literal approach to God's attributes versus a metaphorical one, a broad acceptance of the prophet's companions as sources versus a much more narrow one. And it all trickles down into daily practices like washing versus wiping the feet for prayer.
This quote from one of the sources really captures the scale of this divide, doesn't it? For many followers on both sides, this isn't seen as a minor disagreement over details, but as a vast chasm separating two completely different worldviews.
And this leaves us with a final, pretty provocative question to think about. When the disagreements are this deep, when they touch on the nature of God, the line of authority, the holy book itself, and even daily rituals, where do you draw the line? Are Sunni and Shia Islam two branches of the same tree, or have they grown into something else entirely? That's a question the world is still grappling with today.